Hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Welcome to Curation Across Disciplines. Here we have, and today we have a curator who is, and collection manager who is truly working across disciplines every day. Before I begin, I wanted to do what we often do at the moment, is address students around some housekeeping issues. First of all, you know that you can turn in your responses here on the stage. Please, if you haven't done so yet, do so after class. Secondly, you should have seen an announcement finalizing details for our excursion to Fort Mason, where we're going to have the experience of seeing a U.S. premiere of Isaac Julian's Playtime, as well as a video installation, Capital, inside the Fort Mason complex. We're going to hear and anticipate a little bit more about that experience of cross-disciplinary, cross-media video installation today with Aebric's talk. But you'll also see on there instructions for buses that will be picking you up, taking you to San Francisco, letting you have the experience, and taking you back. A little extra added adventure. You'll see that we're asking you, inviting you to bring a friend. We are really excited that we are, thanks to the generosity of the Kramlich Collection, able to offer you transportation, and also happy that we could bring in more people beyond our course to have the experience. While you're on the bus, you're also going to learn about a digital arts app, a Cal Arts app that we are in the process of developing, where we're trying to create more and more experiences for Cal students and bring them to you easily and accessibly on your phone. So some fabulous engineering students have been working with art students and new media students on a prototype for this app. They're going to do some fun things with you on the bus. Nothing scary, I promise, but that's also part of the experience, and you'll see information about that on the B Courses announcement. So bring a friend, bring somebody who's outside of this class, and if you are here as a Cal student who is not enrolled in our course, make friends with these people, because you can find a buddy and have an experience with us on December 2nd or December 3rd in San Francisco. Should be fun. So with that, it's a super privilege to be able to introduce and welcome Aebhric Coleman. Aebhric Coleman is the director of the Kramlich Collection, a collection that is some almost 30 years in the making of experimental new media art that is often ephemeral and vulnerable, art that creates experiences from a range of materials. And the Kramlichs over time have been incredible supporters of leading artists globally. And have created a collection that has now been widely recognized as probably the most influential private collection of new media art or time-based art in the world. Now, at this moment, what is particularly fabulous for us is that they are working on more and more public formats to be able to share this wide collection with a group, especially groups of students at Cal. And the Isaac Julian's Playtime is one of those experiences. It is amazing that Aebhric has time to even speak to us right now, because he's in the process of creating huge installations, several public programming events, and I think is running his own three-ring circus right now, but came here to tell you more about the history of the collection and anticipate the type of experience we'll get to have in the beginning of December. As the director of the collection, Aebhric is in charge of acquisitions, loans, exhibitions, publications created around the collection, development, as well as conservation. And as it turns out, the conservation of a media art, time-based art, ephemeral art collection is no mean feat. Earlier we had Eric Siegel talking to us about what it was to maintain a collection at the Botanical Gardens. where we learned the difficulty of keeping track of specimens, that he was constantly talking about growing specimens in the botanical gardens, of needing to transplant and replant them, that these fragile specimens required incredible care. It's not dissimilar from the process of maintaining a collection like the Kramlich Collection. These works exist in technological formats that need to be maintained, that sometimes go obsolete, that need to be planted and transplanted to new forms. So we'll hear a bit about that process, as well as many of the public goals, aesthetic goals, and social goals of this amazing collection and of Aebric's work with it. Help me welcome Aebhric Coleman.
Well, Shannon, thank you so much. A very, very generous introduction, and I hope some of what I will go through today will do justice to what Shannon outlined. So let me just get this up and ready. So thank you everyone for coming here. It's really my pleasure to be part of this really adventurous course. I think the idea of working in and learning across disciplines is something that's really timely and really a challenge and an innovation for all of us in the years that come. And I think the place of media art in the middle of all of this is something that hopefully you will see fits very, very correctly with this. This is a cartoon that was at Manifesta, which is an exhibition takes place every 2 years, like a Biennale in Zurich 2 years ago. And this idea that video art is something that's kind of obscure, that you got to find in the depths of the jungle and bring to the broader public, is both somewhat true, but also not quite the case, because it has really become more and more an area of practice for artists. There are very few artists, contemporary artists now, who don't make video art or some form of media art. But also the cultural aspects of what that can mean is something that I'd like to speak with you about today. In particular, this is a work which I'm going to show you a little bit of, called The Enclave by an Irish artist, Richard Moss, who lives in New York. And we're very fortunate to have this work in the collection and on display up the Kramlich residence in Napa, which I will speak a little bit further about. And for us, this is really what media art is about, both in terms of its form and also what the content and the ethical values are in this type of work. So I want to show you a video of about 2 minutes where Richard is speaking about his work, and it will give you a really good sense.
I'm planning this summer to show a brand new piece shot in 2012 and 2013. It's titled The Enclave, and it's the culmination of my work in the Congo. And it's shot on 16mm infrared film, color infrared film. It was used primarily for camouflage detection, and it was designed in collaboration with the US military in the 40s, early 40s during World War II. And this special technology was able to register infrared light, which is invisible to the human eye. It is reflected off the chlorophyll in green plants, healthy green plants. Thereby, they were able to identify the enemy hidden in the landscape. Kodak discontinued it in 2009. And then I thought, well, where should I take this ludicrously paletted bubblegum pink film? And I thought for a while, and I thought, well, I've never been to the Congo. 5.4 million people have died or been killed of war-related causes since 1998, and that's a ton of people. But we don't really hear anything about this ongoing humanitarian disaster. So in that sense, it's this hidden, unseen problem, this unseen conflict. And so I was fascinated then to bring this film, which registers the invisible, makes visible the unseeable, to bring that to a place which also, it was a metaphoric leap, of course, but it was, in my mind, it was a way of sort of trying to bring these two things together and just see what would happen. My work is not a total reaction against journalism. Rather, I am an artist working in places, destinations where journalists also find themselves. The first journey we took into the bush in 2012, and when we were starting to make The Enclave, was deep into isolated pockets of North and South Kivu to visit very, very remote rebel groups who were far beyond the infrastructure of the United Nations, for example. So there's this sort of Hobbesian state of war where everyone's got their back up, and for the last several decades, people have been living in this cycle, sort of a nightmarish cycle of vicious little wars. This is a really opaque place. It's really sad, but nobody really knows anything about them. They don't really want to try and understand them because they're so intangible. So I became interested in this thing that you can't photograph. It's always the problem for me, the impossible photograph. That's really what's at the heart of my work, really.
So I think Richard gives a really good summary, not just of his own practice, but also of the value of some of these media works when you experience them, and that are very distinct from other art forms, and also from going to the movies or anything that you might see on Netflix. And part of that is how these works are installed and what it takes to give life to these things. So this is a technical drawing produced by a German company that we worked with to install not only this work, but the other installations in Napa. They're real specialists in this area. And as you can see, you've got 6 hanging screens, you've got 10 speakers and a subwoofer, you've got projectors. Everything has to be planned out and detailed in advance. And that's really a lot of the background work that's required. So there's architectural issues, technical issues, acoustic things, which I'll speak a little bit more about. The same can also be true of what are very simple works in principle. This is a sketch from an early piece by Anthony McCall called Line Describing a Cone, one of his most well-known works. And essentially what that is a projected light piece, but based on film. So what happens is at the start of the projection, you have a tiny dot which forms into a linear circle. And as that happens, it's projected in a space that in early days was a smoke-filled room, and now is done with hazers. And you have this incredible social sculpture performative aspect, whereas you as the viewer are trying to understand what this image is, and the image takes this sculptural form. A similar work from 1975 by Anthony McCall is 4 projected movements, and Anthony does these really beautiful drawings, and this is one of the original ones, and it's essentially 4 linear beams of light from 4 projectors. But what's really interesting about this piece is it's performative, both for you as a viewer in the space, but also in terms of how this actually comes to be. And what happens is you have 4 16mm projectors that are on the ground that are running essentially one piece of film per projector 4 times. And so it becomes a kind of mechanical piece, but where the operator is like the artist and a performer. So you as a viewer are as much part of the performance as the projectionist. 4 projectionists are required at all times. They feed in the film one way, then once it's finished, they turn it around, feed it in another way, then they flip it over and they do the same twice more times. So each piece of film gets shown 4 times on 4 projectors. So there's this kind of variation that happens and a choreography. But what's interesting is when it comes to showing a work like this, it's got to be on film. You can't do that digitally in a good way. It's got to be a specific kind of film. It's got to be double perforation with the sprockets on both sides, because otherwise you can't flip over the film. 2 years ago, Kodak discontinued that stock. So you've all these kind of issues that go into something that in its essence is quite simple. Equally, this is an audio piece, one that maybe some of you saw 2 years ago. We loaned it and presented it to Fort Mason. It's a piece called 40-Part Motet by Janet Cardiff. It's a very extraordinary piece that is very emotive and affecting. It is based on a 16th century choral piece by Thomas Tallis, where it was orchestrated for 40 individual choir singers to sing in unison. But what the artist did was mic'd them individually so that from each speaker you hear an individual singer. And so you hear both the overall choir, but as you walk around you hear each of them. And so the speaker becomes an embodiment of the person. And a beautiful part of the piece is that there's an interval at the end of the 15 minutes where you hear them prepping for the performance, and you hear them chatting about, you know, what they're going to have for dinner and stuff in the evening. And so it's a very kind of live performative piece that sometimes is shown in religious spaces but can also be shown in more neutral ones. On the back end, there's quite a lot to organize an installation of this. It has to be in quite an acoustically reverberant space, so not like this. They want it very sharp, very loud, so it really fills the space. It's made up of 8 different choirs of 5 speakers, so everything is very precisely labeled. The arrangement is very precise. The height of the speakers has to be in relationship to you as a person. This is a diagram that we did, and my colleague Courtney on our team prepared this so that we would be knowing for future installations what is required. And sorry, this diagram's a little faint, but this is the technical diagram of the playback systems and how each is connected to the different speakers. So there's a lot kind of behind what is a very simple, minimal installation. Another work which we would consider a media piece is this work by Joan Jonas, made up of 5 different rooms. This is one of them. This is a piece she produced for the Venice Biennale in 2015, representing the United States, called They Come to Us Without a Word. We're very fortunate that we were able to acquire the work for the collection, and one of our next priorities is to try and have this seen in the United States. It's not yet had a life here, and that's important for her and for us. It is made up of projections. It's made up of sculptural found objects. It's made up of vitrines with little found items that she has gathered, watercolor drawings, prints, seating, which is made as sculptural object, and also custom light fittings. So sometimes these media works have many, many different dimensions to them. There are different definitions of what a media artwork is. The one that we use predominantly is that it can be described as a time-based work. In other words, an artwork that has a specific duration in order to see it in its entirety. The works may be entirely digital, electronic, or may have an analog component, for instance, photographic slide works. And all require some form of display equipment in order to be experienced, usually audiovisual. Now, as I say, there are works that we classify media works where there's a performative aspect as well. And museums sometimes with departments separate those out, but that's not always such a clear boundary to make. To give a little bit of background of how I myself got into this, my father is one of these artists who in the early 60s started experimenting with different forms. He studied as a painter, but very early on was more interested in film and video. This is a photograph of more recent work of his, which is presented on a very large LED screen. It's currently at a really important and wonderful show at the Dallas Art Museum called Truth 24 Frames a Second. It's one of the biggest exhibitions of media art in the US. There's a publication coming out by Yale, and the curator, Gavin Delahunty, is one of the best curators working out there. And he's very interested in the idea of how media works in particular operate in a post-truth world. And so do please look up at least about the show. If any of you are going to Dallas over the next few months, I encourage you to take a look. This piece is of a short loop of essentially a carnival ride with children having a great time going around, but it's slowed down and looped in this repetitive way with a very loud kind of electronic thumping soundtrack. So there's this hypnotic but also kind of scary aspect to it, and it's presented in a large space like this. Another exhibition that he did last year at the Marion Goodman Gallery in London shows a slide piece. On the left, it's a work called Photograph, a synchronized slide projection piece, which was something produced in 1998 in Dublin in Ireland that I was very involved in the genesis of the work being produced, putting together technical crew, and a lot of the photographic aspects and the casting. It was produced in a semi-abandoned school in the north side of Dublin in a kind of very poor part. And the premise of the work is about these school children who are really into dance. And it goes into these mythologies of Irish history, but also stories of the Chinese chalk circle and ways to get out of one's environment. This is an image from an exhibition at the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid. This was a big exhibition of his work that I was very closely involved in. Entailed, in this case, a work from 1991 on 35mm film with a loop system. You see that on the floor. And this piece is continuous. And essentially it involves this actor, who was a famous soap opera actor in France, falling over this medical table. The action takes only a couple of seconds, but it's spread out over 20 minutes. This was a more involved production where I was involved in the commissioning of this piece that ended up with Harvey Keitel as the main actor. It's a piece called Retake with Evidence, set around the story of Oedipus. And as part of the process of commissioning and fundraising for the work, we also had to put a crew of 40 people together, including set designers from the UK and a cinematographer from Finland. So a lot of logistics, like essentially producing a small film. And that's oftentimes what is required to produce these works. And then there were different uses of, or different methods of presenting video art into public space. This was an idea we had to present a work from 1980 that typically was just presented on a monitor. We decided to present it on a huge outdoor LED screen. So we had to find a company that would do that and do all the kind of public permitting and everything else to make that possible in a museum courtyard in Dublin. To return to the Kramlich collection, the Kramlichs I was fortunate to meet about 20 years ago in the mid-90s. They had acquired one of my father's works, and so we had gotten to know each other over the years. And I've been working with them now 5 years. The principal core of the collection is media art. We have over 150 works which require essentially their own space to be experienced. In addition to that, there's about 250 single channel works which can be presented in more flexible ways, including on monitors. They've been gifted to the New Art Trust, which I'll describe in a moment. There's nearly 100 artists in the collection from over 20 countries. And the significance of that is more in terms of the content of the work and the interest in issues that are of kind of more global and cultural significance. The Kramlichs have always traveled extensively, and so that's reflected in their interest in different conditions of life and humanity from around the world. There is a private aspect to the collection. The collection is essentially developed by the Kramlichs, but there has been for over 20 years a very public-facing aspect to that, both through loans, but also through an organization called the New Art Trust, which was set up in 1997 as a collaborative mechanism to promote the field of media art. And it's, over the last 10 years, principally partnered with SF MoMA in San Francisco, MoMA in New York, and the Tate in London. And essentially what that is a means to promote research and conservation for media art. And one of the projects which has had a number of iterations is called Matters in Media Art. And essentially that has set certain standards and best practices for both the acquisition, documentation, loan, and more recently digital preservation of media works. They launched a new website last year, which the address is there at the bottom. If any of you are interested, I really encourage you to take a look. Everybody worked on that between the museums, and it's been a very influential and important project, which is very much ongoing. Another part of the New Art Trust has been that the Kramlichs have gifted over 35 works of some significance. Some of them are large-scale installations to the New Art Trust museums. And in addition, last year we set up an acquisition fund that would allow the 3 museums to purchase work that they chose. And so the idea was that the curators of the 3 museums would come together and decide what they'd like to buy, that otherwise it would be hard for them to raise the funds. we would contribute 50%, and the museums would contribute the rest collectively. It's an interesting mechanism. It's only had its first iteration, quite an ambitious one, where 4 film works by Bruce Connor were acquired for MoMA and SF MoMA, and this is one of the works, Crossroads. We've also been involved in public conferences, such as this one that the Tate and the Getty co-organized, called Media in Transition, really around the future of museums and how they adapt to showing and caring for media artworks. We had also invited all of the participants, around 40 people, to come a few months prior to the conference to the Kramlich's home in Napa to have essentially a 2 or 3 day intensive workshop so that they could discuss a lot of their ideas together prior to the conference. We did a similar thing last November. This is the screening room up at the residence in Napa. With SF MoMA, they held their first media art retreat, and we invited curators from around the world. From Australia, the person standing there is Andrea Lassoni, the curator of film and media art at the Tate. We had conservators, we had a range of artists, and it was a really interesting day-long gathering with presentations. What's emerging more and more is that in the area of media art, curatorial and conservation really merge together. So you have, while people are coming from different skill sets and training, more and more museums are recognizing that actually you can't curate this work without knowing some of the conservation issues. And similarly, you can't conserve the work unless you understand what they are meant to be as an experience. From our side, that's very much been reflected in how we developed the team from as soon as I started. We have 2 full-time media conservators and 2 curatorial colleagues, and they are in contact all of the time in a very collaborative way. This is our colleague Eric, who works in New York at a facility that we set up just for the storage of the media works, the physical media. Part of that is, very detailed collection management of media tapes, but also analog. There's an analog film desk, and we also have racks of equipment for digitization and other things like that. To manage that, we have a database that goes into quite some detail to gather all of the different component information that can be curatorial, acquisition, rights-based, but even things such as knowing where every single tape is. And so we have a record for every single tape. They're photographed, they're barcoded, and they have individual inventory numbers. These are the kind of things that you don't need to do if you have just a photograph in the same type of way, but for the life of these works, it's super important. Equally, we set up a preservation level digital backup system, working with a company in the UK. On the top of the diagram, you will see there's kind of 3 venues: data center A and B, and then UK escrow, which is where the content is stored onto LTO tape and put into a separate vault. So you have geographic distribution for safety of the material, but then also we custom designed an architecture that would allow us to have 3 additional copies for both storage and access purposes, one in New York, one in San Francisco, and one in Napa. And what's cool about it is that you go into the residence in San Francisco and Napa, you have an Apple TV, and you have instant access to the content. So we've made it such that it's very user-friendly, but at the back end it really preserves the life of these works into the future. I want to speak a little bit more about the process of installing these works, and if you like, the interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary nature of what you need to kind of take into account. So this is an early drawing of the Kramlich residence in Napa. This is from 1998. The project has its origins in the year before, 1997. It's a building designed by Herzog de Meuron. It's one that took 19 years to complete. There's the history and design aspects of why that is a topic for a whole other conversation. But safe to say that there was the idea that a home for their collection would entail darkened space underground, as well as more residential space on top. When I started, essentially 5 years ago, this was the nature of the building. It was still very much a kind of concrete hole in the ground that would require quite a lot of imagination to make sure that it would stay flexible into the future. This was a huge amount of effort to already get to this point. This was essentially dug out of a hill. And we tried to optimize it as much as possible to be flexible to present these works. This is a space finished, ready for, if you like, installation. There's a raised access floor under which we have a HVAC system, an electrical system that we tried to make as flexible as possible depending on the layout of the exhibitions. One of the most important things that we looked at in terms of infrastructure is we put in a really, really good wireless system. And so we did a lot of study. It's a complex building being underground and with many big concrete walls to make sure, and you can see these colorful diagrams, these are heat maps. So we went through the building and we were very assiduous about making sure that we would have coverage throughout. That was important not just so that we'd be able to communicate with each other in the building for phones and everything, but also in terms of how we wished people to experience the artworks. We have designed the system so that we're able to walk around with an iPad and essentially turn on and off the artworks and play them no matter where you are in the building. And that works really well because to experience these works, you do need to move through space. Another reason is that this is a diagram of the technical equipment that's required to play that Richard Moss piece that you saw at the beginning. So at the top of this in the gray, you've got 6 projectors, you've got six HDMI card units that are then connected in the blue to a lot of the playback system. You've got pretty high-end media players that are connected to various audio controllers, and then at the bottom you see you've 10 different types of speaker and a subwoofer. The relevance of that is we've got to make sure that this stuff works reliably on a consistent basis. And part of that when you're designing the space is cabling. So these are diagrams on the top of the cables that we ran in the ceiling, and on the bottom the cables that we ran under the access floor. So a lot of planning before, all of this had to be done before we built out the space. We had to make sure we could do this. In addition, we also put in a very good internet system. We started off with just a 4G Verizon connection, and then we're able to partner with a company to have 200 megabit dedicated internet service. It's something that we use more just for day-to-day purposes, but we know as soon as we get into more ambitious pieces that may require streaming or augmented reality or anything like that, we need good internet service. And so we have essentially a wireless connection between a point in Napa and our property that's dedicated. So it's impossible to run fiber to the building. It's too expensive. So to speak a little bit more about the curatorial process, and firstly I'm going to just talk about the spatial aspects and then more about the actual content of the works. This is an image from early on in 2013 when I was trying to figure out how we would present video in essentially a glass box. And so even in the midst of a construction site, you know, doing tests to imagine what a screen would look like and where a projector might go, these were the kind of tests that we did in the field. In the large exhibition space, we had the luxury that it was complete and empty before we did any construction of the exhibition spaces. So we essentially taped out ideas of what the rooms might look like and could walk it through. On the basis of that, we ended up with a layout that looked a little bit like this. And if you can see there, the main big exhibition space is on the right and divided up into different artworks. Worked with a German architect, Tim Hooper from Hamburg on this, and he was really terrific to work with because he had a good creative imagination combined with a lot of strong technical sense. We saw very quickly, we didn't build this because when we looked at it, we felt that it was too museum-like. A lot of hallways and corridors, and it would be too institutional for something that is essentially a home. Now, there's nothing wrong with this maybe in a public setting, but the process of us seeing the problems with this was interesting, and it brought us to a realization that we needed to do something different. This was a variation of this idea, but it started to get really complicated. We were concerned that people would just get confused. So we went back to the drawing board, and this is a sketch our architect did of different models of how we might lay out the space. This was the idea of constructing essentially a number of boxes, which we did a version of in the end, but not exactly like this. We were concerned that in doing the boxes this way, the hallways that would be created above and below the boxes would be a little claustrophobic. We looked at doing something that was much more open plan, like a fishbone. We decided not to do this for the reason that if you were to present many works at the same time, you would have a lot of acoustic spill. And also, it's important for a lot of these pieces that you have a certain focus and sense of being cocooned, so that you really have some concentration. And the risk is people would just wander and nobody really see anything. This idea of doing a more panopticon, where you see loads of works at the same time, this has been done on a couple of group exhibitions. This can work, but typically better if it's pieces that don't have audio, because there can be a lot of spillover. So we didn't give too much time to this, but we gave some consideration to it. In the end, this is what the layout that we worked out. And essentially what we did is we built, sorry, I don't have a laser pointer, but we built 3 boxes and made a pathway, which you can see in the pink dotted line, of how people would circulate. And the key thing that we decided to do, which we have the advantage of being able to do, because the Kramlich residence is not a public space, so the tours are essentially guided, is we sequence the presentation of the works. So you go in as a group and you see the work from start to finish. And it's a very interesting experience. We can talk a little bit more about it at the end if you wish. We made a decision that we felt it important that people have an opportunity to really give time to these pieces and really be affected by them, and not just pop in and out for a minute or two. And the response we've had has actually been amazing. There was a lot of dynamic from groups who actually do wish to stay and watch them, even if they've never seen any of these kind of pieces before. And this is also true for the Richard Moss piece, which is about 40 minutes long. A couple of just other diagrams of different kind of conceptual ideas of how to add some more dynamism to the space. We didn't proceed with those in the end, but a big factor was, because a lot of these artworks have sound, we want to make sure that they've really good acoustic environments. So this is a diagram of where we put acoustics in the ceiling of the space. We had to do a lot of study and engineering work to make sure that we were able to install these things properly, make sure we didn't penetrate the roof in a way that would be bad, because there's a garden above that gets watered a lot, and we definitely didn't want it to rain on top of the artworks. We did some visualizations of at what point the acoustics should be done. We opted for this one, where it's more kind of hidden. And then we had to look at the acoustic walls that we were building. We did a lot of stretched fabric acoustics, so you don't see where the acoustic material is, because it's usually not so elegant to look at. And then we did stretched fabric ceilings as well. I'll show you some photographs of the final installations in a minute. Equally, from a construction point of view, media works require construction which is a little bit different, so that the sound doesn't transfer between things. We did studies of how to stretch the fabric and put the acoustic material. We did visualizations of, what that would look like in the end. Do you make the hard wall stand out from the acoustic wall, or do you get it looking more integrated like in this image? Equally, there was a lot of geometry that we had to figure out in terms of how some of these installations could work. And part of that is everything had to be pre-planned. If we wanted to get it looking very simple and thought through, we had to work out all of this stuff in advance. Okay, that's the practical side of this stuff. More importantly, the reason why we go to that effort is because the content of these works is really important. This is one of the first pieces that we have installed. It's a work by a French artist called Pierre Huyghe, called Untitled Human Mask. And it's about 15 minutes long. It's a really extraordinary work. It's one of these pieces that you will never forget it once you see it. It's located in a small town that was abandoned after the Fukushima earthquake and tsunami. And it starts off by showing a drone that goes through this abandoned town, and there's literally no human presence there anymore. You're then entered into a space which is kind of a wreck and has the signs of being a former restaurant. And then there's this character, and this is one of the opening scenes, that it's a process of discovery, but it turns out to be a monkey. And it's a real monkey wearing a mask, a no mask from Japanese theater, a wig, and essentially a woman's apron. It sounds very weird. It is very weird, but it was inspired by a video that went viral on YouTube in 2008 of this exact same monkey, a girl monkey called Fukushan, who was serving in this local Japanese restaurant. And a lot of the local clientele would come and have fun watching this monkey who would come and serve them sake and hot towels and some of the dishes. And that video had gone viral on the internet. And after the Fukushima disaster, Pierre Huyghe brought the monkey back into this environment. The thing that's important to note in that original video is the monkey is wearing a mask, is wearing a wig, and an apron. And if you go online, some of you on your computers, you will find it. You'll also find, which is even more strange, there's a Facebook page showing the restaurant after it was renovated, and people going, making more videos of their interactions with these monkeys and taking photographs. Now, it's hard to communicate the effect of watching this work without seeing it, but essentially the experience of this monkey going back into an abandoned space where it's learned all these human habits and attributes, but yet the humans have left, is a very eerie one. And it's a simple thing that one forgets, that in situations of natural disasters, animals are very much affected. So in the case of the fires up in Napa and Sonoma, in addition to the human consequences, which are very real, there's the effect on nature and animal life. And Pierre Huyghe is an artist that has been spoken about in terms of ideas of the post-human, and that can mean environments where humans have left for whatever reason, like this, but it also means where us as human beings are not the center of the world. It's post-humanism. It's thinking that we need to really engage in our relationship with nature and the environment and animals. And so this is the value of a work like this and the types of work that are in the collection. Right afterwards, we have a piece that's somewhat in contrast, a 4-minute piece by a Romanian artist called Sic Transit gloriamundi. And that artist is Romanian and very interested in ideas of cultural identity and nationality. And it starts off by you seeing a ring of people who are lying somewhat prostrate on the ground, as though in a healing or begging position, and they have their hands laid out as though they were receiving alms. This woman that you see visualized goes around and puts a fuse, like a dynamite fuse, onto their hands and then lights it. And as it goes around, you see their hands flicker with the pain of this, and a lot of their hands are bandaged. And as it does this, there's a very loud drum that it's a monastic drum, and the sound gets stronger and stronger until there's this climatic point where the woman holding the fuse lets the spark go out. And really this work is going into certain reflections of where we get our identity from, be they cultural, local ones, or religious ones. And there are so many religious references in this. Sic transit gloriamundi means thus passes the glory of the world, which was uttered at 3 different points during the papal coronation ceremonies from 1400 up to the 60s, at the same point where they would also light a line of flax. And so the idea of incense and embers and the symbols of circles as being a connecting point between life on earth and the afterlife goes back to pagan traditions, pre-Hindu religions, many, many layers that are in this short 4-minute piece. At the front here you see a work by Joseph Beuys. It's a simple multiple piece. I'm conscious of time. I will speed up a little bit. This is a piece by Jane and Louise Wilson from 1997. It's a 4-channel, 4-screen installation piece. It's about 5 minutes long, and it was shot in the former headquarters of the Stasi in East Berlin. These artists are really interested in spaces and architectures that were designed for power, and this one being for surveillance. And the physicality of this is really quite eerie. You go down hallways and you see these interrogation rooms with padded doors where neighbors would have to be quizzed on the activities of their families and friends, and all this information gathered in a kind of very analog way on index cards. And they designed special elevators that would bring these boxes of index cards up and down. Now, it's abandoned space, probably turned into apartments now, but what's incredible about some of these works is, even though it's 20 years old, you go in and you start to reflect on issues about surveillance and information gathering and what goes on that you don't see in some of these hidden spaces. Hidden histories and hidden stories is something that was a kind of theme connecting some of the works for us. This is a work by Shereena Shot called Rapture from 1999. It's a 2-screen installation, so you have the women on one side, the men on the other. It was filmed in northern Morocco, but Shereena Shot is an Iranian artist who's been exiled in the US for nearly the last 30 years. And this is one of her, and Kalalum, yes. And she gave a talk here a couple of years ago as well. She's a filmmaker as well. There's a new film of hers coming out shortly, and I strongly encourage you to see her film Women Without Men. It's an amazing film from 4 or 5 years ago. And this work is really a piece that situates you in a very specific cultural reference point, but where you as the viewer are having to choose who you're looking at and at what point. And so the physicality of you being in a space and not just in a cinema staring at a single screen is really an important part of this work. On the left, you see a portion of a very large photograph by Richard Moss, taken from the Congo with this infrared film, and it's on the borderline between Congo and Rwanda. And this is an installation view of the Richard Moss piece. And you know, just as a little scholarly reference, I was reading recently a book by Slavoj Zizek called Violence. Very prolific writer. I'm a big fan of his work. And in the first opening pages, he refers to the Congo today has effectively re-emerged as a Conradian heart of darkness. No one dares to confront it head on. The death of a West Bank Palestinian child, not to mention an Israeli or an American, is mediatically worth thousands of times more than the death of a nameless Congolese. Do we need further proof that the humanitarian sense of urgency is mediated, indeed overdetermined, by clear political considerations? Now, there's a lot to what he's saying, and I won't try to summarize it here, but essentially he's looking at, you know, how violence exists in our society and how we see that. And this is a really important part of, as Richard Moss was describing early on, how do you do that? Because when you experience this work, The Enclave, you will see scenes where soldiers are rehearsing, they're play acting, and some of them are playing dead, but then you see real dead bodies. And you're conscious of the fact that aside from sometimes those images are very beautiful in a way that's terrifying, you're also not sure that if you saw that as a still image, you'd know what you'd be looking at. And that, I think, is the value of some of these works. This is just an overview of the plan of works that we installed. And the last thing I'd like to discuss, as Shannon indicated, is this exhibition of Isaac Julian that we're really excited to have partnered with Fort Mason and many wonderful institutions like UC Berkeley in terms of trying to make Isaac's work reach out to a broader public. This is a still image from the 7-channel installation of Playtime when it was first shown in London. And this is a piece that is really about the question of the effect and role of money and capital in our life. We all need it. We're all affected by it. But after the financial crisis, we were all thrown into a tailspin. And Isaac chose to look at that, and through 3 different geographic instances, Dubai, as seen here, London, and also Iceland. And he did it through a number of different characters, and in this case, a Filipina maid who's working in Dubai and away from her family. And it looks at this very human component to how she tries to maintain a link to her own values and identity in an environment which is both real and also unreal in its kind of spectacular form in the middle of the desert. As part of this is a scene of the stock exchange in Dubai, and very much a reflection of the piece, when hopefully you get to see it, is that we're living a time when money is somewhat immaterial. It's all gone digital, and networks and currencies is the new standard. The backdrop is this work called Capital, which is a 30-minute piece, which is essentially the intellectual backbone to Isaac's interests, where he interviewed David Harvey, a Marxist intellectual, and a number of other well-known scholars who were present in the audience. On the left, that's Stuart Hall, who passed away recently. And ideas of how to represent capital were the key part of the discussion. And then the third work that we also have on show at the new SFAI Media Gallery is the single screen version of 10,000 Waves, which is called A Better Life. And the premise of that work was essentially stimulated when Isaac had read about Chinese immigrant workers who had drowned off Morecambe Bay in England because they just didn't have local knowledge. They were not able to speak English. They went out picking cockles, trying to earn a living, and the tide came quickly in. And this is a well-known thing in that area, but they didn't realize. And part of what's in the piece is the surveillance footage of the Coast Guard trying to rescue, unfortunately not succeeding in rescuing most of the people. And that Isaac turns this into a broader tale about our aspirations for a better life, the nature of work in contemporary society, and also how cultural traditions change. And it's a really beautiful, beautiful work. And this is the practical information. It opens public on December 1st, and we're delighted that it continues all the way through February 11th in 2018. So we really encourage you to go and take a look at it, and tell your friends. If you see any articles or anything that relate to it afterwards, please share them on social media. Any bit of additional coverage that we can get for the show would be much appreciated. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to take questions of any kind, if you have.
Let's do a first round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aebhric. Maybe we have microphones coming now. I'll start with maybe as people are thinking up their questions, I'll start off with one. I'll start off with one. There's so much richness here, both in terms of content, subject, as well as pragmatics. And I really appreciate that you showed us the internals and the internal infrastructure for curating and sustaining the work. People who know this kind of work or experience this kind of work may not have realized how much there is behind the scenes. And you presented it so beautifully, and in a way that shows how many great, amazing solutions you've devised. But I imagine along the way there were solutions attempted or experiments attempted that didn't work, or an attempt to put together the collection, or to imagine wiring, or to imagine anything about the infrastructure for this that didn't work, or that needed to be revised 10 years later. Can you tell a story about something like that, something where you had to really rethink what you were doing in the middle?
Well, one of the points which I referenced earlier was we had been going along the lines of installing these works like just in a museum context with these hallways and kind of dark passages. And when we got to think about it, we were concerned that aside from feeling a little claustrophobic, that we may not achieve what we really want to achieve, which is that people watch these works and engage in them. And there's a curious thing that this field of media art emerged principally in the 60s. I mean, there's certainly examples of artists working on film and other forms going back even to the 20s. But as an area that's emerged out of the 60s and the 70s, artists were reacting to the space of cinema. And they didn't wish to have seats in spaces, for instance. They didn't wish to necessarily be in museums. You know, we have artists in the collection like Dara Birnbaum who've spoken about they wanted their work to be distributed any way it could be, and television was a good way of that. And some of these early works were born out of more adventurous collaborations with television, public television, both in the US and in Europe. But what's interesting is that as that practice became more institutionalized in museum spaces, you have a phenomenon that those spaces are built, but people aren't aware about the time that's required to see them. And we're all guilty of this. You know, you go to a big exhibition and you kind of imagine, oh, well, I spend 2 hours, and yet you might find one single piece, like the Kid Yartensen visitors piece at SF MoMA is about an hour long, but it's the best hour you're going to ever spend. It's amazing. And you know, for museums to communicate that and for you to be aware of that is a challenge. And I think that's where we made quite a pivot late in the stage of our, I mean, the change happened like literally 2 weeks before we were building walls. And we just knew we had a problem and we didn't know how to fix it. And so the diagrams of looking at the alternative ways was a quick fix that was necessary. And I think that's an interesting factor in terms of how museums present these works. And for instance, the Dallas Museum, which is showing about 20 works, they've come up with a new ticketing system that over the course of the exhibition, you buy one ticket and you can go back 3 or 4 times, which I think is an interesting way of you know, offering the public an opportunity to, because, you know, not everybody's going to spend 3 or 4 hours in a go.
Great, thank you.
Hello. I was just wondering that in an age where there's so much content created through media, like you look at websites like YouTube, other such things, and people are able to get access to high-grade video-making technology at lower and lower prices, do you see a change in curation trying to find like such videographers at lower levels, or does it still like maintain itself only at like museums pick out certain pieces and then they just get like transferred along to like other exhibitions and so on and so forth?
That's a great question, and I think there's not a simple answer to that, because the speed at which video has entered our lives in the last couple of years, I mean, it's really not that long ago that with iCloud, for instance, the way that photo streams worked, it didn't store your video. So you were reliant on that video to be stored on your device, and you would spend, you know, more money on your device for that possibility. It's only in the last 2 years or so that that's not an issue. So we're all shooting more and more video. So the speed at which that changed, particularly in terms of video, has become the predominant communication form, even for instant messaging, is significant. And I think when it comes to, you know, creative content, you know, we have all become, you know, Joseph Beuys spoke in the 70s about all of us are artists, and we all have that capacity. That has, and Andy Warhol as well, you know, the 15 seconds of fame, the coincidence of those two things is somewhat turning out to be true. however, when it comes to making artworks, I think there's a certain intentionality to people who really dedicate their lives to it. And one common strand amongst the very diverse range of personalities and backgrounds that you will find amongst artists is that the really good ones, it's like a calling in life, you know, and the financial aspect, which is certainly true for a lot of these early media artists, they had no sense that anybody would ever watch this stuff, buy this stuff. You know, Dara Birnbaum, who is a real pioneer in this field, we've asked her to write an essay for this book that we're working on, and she speaks very matter-of-factly about she never imagined that a collection such as this one would ever exist. And so the market of, even at the high end of this kind of work being collected, you know, there are very few individual collectors in the world that collect this. And museums have started to do it much more. And there are very few museums now that don't collect this work. But there's only a minority of those that actually know how to collect it and know how to show it. So I think that's something that's going to change quite a bit over the coming years. And I think the methods for the good stuff to be seen and digitally accessed is also changing. There's a couple of companies that have distribution hardware systems, somewhat like a Netflix combined with an Apple TV, that would allow you to acquire these pieces and enjoy them in an easy way. That doesn't discount for a minute, you know, this type of work being on YouTube or on Netflix or something like this. I think the curious thing, though, is that, and this is, as I say, this is not a black and white issue, is that a lot of artists who have put their video work on YouTube for free consumption, you'll find that not many people watch it. And I don't know why that is, but I think it's partly because there is so much content out there that, you know, finding stuff online is still probably one of the biggest challenges that we all face. You know, there's an ad at the moment by one of these TV guides about, you know, the Netflix kind of angst, where you sit in front of Netflix for half an hour trying to figure out what to watch. It's like me when I went to DVD stores. So I think that's an aspect, but also I think the really, you know, why do people go to museums? Museums in this age of constant entertainment on our devices are experiencing, for the most part, larger visitor numbers than they ever have. And so I think while cinemas are not, museums are. And I think part of that is to find experiences which are different. And so, you know, there are initiatives where museums like MoMA will curate content that is publicly submitted. So they get 20,000 videos and they have to sit in a room for a week to filter through them. So museums are tackling those kind of questions.
Hi, thank you for a fantastic presentation. My question is twofold. One, if you could talk a little bit about the future of the collection. How big will it grow? Is there an imagined limit? And also about the architecture of the spaces that are displaying the works. Do they have any, and the kind of mission for building them, is there flexibility planned? Are they permanent installations just for those particular pieces, or in 10 years is it going to flip over and be redesigned? Yeah, can you speak to that, please?
They're very pertinent questions because they're very much on our mind. I think in terms of acquisitions, we have over the last 5 years not acquired in quantity, but we've acquired larger pieces. The Isaac Julian Playtime was a co-production, so that was Isaac sending us an idea. He had filmed part of it but not completed it, and we really felt that was an important work to see the light of day. We have commissioned a few works that are kind of born out of the property up in Napa, but given a very carte blanche to the artists in terms of what they might wish to produce. And we're thinking that more and more we will likely do that kind of thing, because there's still a lot of artwork that of this nature that it's hard to get finance for. There isn't, it doesn't fit within a typical cinema production business model, and galleries don't necessarily have the ambition to do that. So I think that's something we're more interested in. When it comes to, and you know, if part of the question may connect to future technologies, personally I've not seen much virtual reality that's of interest, more because I think that the more interesting area is augmented reality. I think that's going to have a bigger significance in all our lives, but particularly in a kind of museum educational situation. I think especially because this idea of walking around with a physical piece of glass that I keep breaking is also, we're going to, in 10 years' time, we're going to think we were Neanderthals doing that. So the idea that we're going to wear big headsets is also crazy to me. In terms of the architecture up at the property, it's completely flexible. We designed that for those works. We will be cycling those over. I think the next presentation we will largely use the same layout because we just put a lot of effort into it. But probably for the third one, it'll all be taken down. And you know, the beauty is that big space, we can put one work if we need to. So we're very flexible.
So a related question, how does one visit? I mean, it's a private house, and it's interesting that it's a private house. You wanted to keep it feeling like a private house. That probably constrains the number of people who can get there and how it's open to the public. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about your thinking about that.
It's something that we think a lot about, and it's the reason it's private is mostly a permitting one. In Napa Valley, the permitting system is quite controlled, has been for a long time. You'll notice that when you're driving up Valley, you will never ever see a Starbucks or a McDonald's or anything like that. The fast food chain that's in St. Helena has been there 30 years ago. They would never permit one again. So they're kind of funny like that. Even for wineries, they don't necessarily allow easy access. So that's a kind of just a specificity of permitting in that area. And where the property is located is residential. However, I think that in reflecting on that as we were completing the property, we realized that to really experience the collection as presented there, which is only a portion of it, you need to spend 3 to 4 to 5 hours to really see it. That straight away limits your audience just in and of itself. We know that that's not necessarily going to appeal to a lot of people to do that. And so in thinking about that, there is a certain desire to kind of focus on people who will get the most out of it. The installations have only been complete a year. We've had a lot of museum groups. We've had groups from different areas that have seen that. I think what we'd next like to work on, and we do have some plans on that, is that there is some access for students who are really interested in this field and could get a lot out of it. But I think we, as Shannon mentioned, we're really working on public programming more actively. So a piece like Playtime, it's a big installation. It needs to be seen by a certain critical mass, just like the Joan Jonas. And their priorities for us to do that. We have no intentions of showing the Joan Jonas up in Napa because I just don't feel we would do justice in terms of public access to the works.
More explicitly though, in order to see it, assuming that I had the 4 hours, what would I do?
You'd have to get in touch with us. For the moment, we haven't put a clear structure in place, so we don't yet have a website. We're to be honest, you know, this is a project that's taken 20 years pretty much for the Kramlichs to finish. They moved in 6 months ago. So we're giving them a little time to enjoy, you know, their bedrooms and stuff. They go up there at the weekends. So we don't want to inundate them with visits before we let them kind of. But you know, we're thinking a lot about that, but mindful also of the neighbors who have endured a long period of construction and everything else. So.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. How are the works valued when you're acquiring them?
It's a good question. I mean, like a lot of art, there's no fixed metric. In a few hours' time, we will find out whether the Leonardo goes for 100 million, 200 million. Who knows? I mean, the simple answer is that the galleries determine the acquisition price when you're purchasing the work. Typically, these works are sold in an edition. So much like prints, it's a limited edition. It ranges from edition of 4 to edition of 10. It tends not to be a large edition. And with that, you're essentially acquiring a license of ownership, exhibition, and you know, within that, there's now somewhat agreed standards that you gain conservation rights as well in terms of migrating the work to digital formats and being able to do that. But, you know, the value of these works changes quite significantly, and I think the main thing is that if you look on the secondary market, the auction market, you will rarely see these kind of works that come up for sale, and rarely will the value be the same as what it costs to buy them through a gallery. But that's, the auction market is funny with contemporary art that way. Sometimes it's, the auctions are a good place to get a bargain.
There's a growing criticism of kind of San Francisco's old wealth patronage, that it really just includes white male artists, and beyond, I was wondering for the Kramlich Foundation, beyond just having the ideology of we're going to be more inclusive, if there's any formal structure for including people of color and women artists.
Well, there's not a formal structure, but it's something that there are many women artists in the collection. There are many artists from diverse backgrounds, you know, culturally, but equally many black artists and Asian artists. So, for instance, Isaac Julian, you know, has a very important history in black cinema, in queer cinema, but also in broader cultural studies. And so that's one of the reasons we felt that his work is important to be involved in, and important for the San Francisco Bay community particularly to be seen. And so one of the things we're trying to do and convey in presenting these works is Playtime was produced in those 3 locations of London, one of the financial capitals of the world, Dubai, the Middle East, and Iceland, also a key financial area. And they were very impacted by the financial crisis, and one of the first areas that came out of it was San Francisco Bay Area and Silicon Valley, and both on the financial but also communications and healthcare to an extent has been incredibly important in transforming the way we work, the way we communicate. And yet there are these other sides to that development and economic prosperity that is felt very in real ways, not just in San Francisco, but in Berkeley and Oakland and everywhere else. And Isaac, I think, does a really good job at kind of relaying those complex intertwined narratives. And it's something that we really hope that when you go and see these pieces, you really think about the changes that are going on in this local area as told through these pieces. And you know, one of the things we're really trying to do at Fort Mason and our other partners is to have, Fort Mason is not a museum, they're not a collecting entity, and this is a kind of a new departure for them. We really want them to reach out to other communities, Chinese community, Filipino communities, Spanish speaking ones, to attract a different kind of public that's not necessarily going to museums. And I think that's something that we wish to do. There's other artists in the collection like Steve McQueen. We're really fortunate. We have a lot of works by him, early works that the Kramlichs had acquired, over 20 years ago before nobody heard of Steve McQueen. But even in the last 5 years, we've acquired 3 major pieces of his. And, he's one of the most important artists and filmmakers working today.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your experience. So I have an experience work with contemporary Korean artists who never been introduced to United States audience, and they bring some works that they have dialogues or commentaries in Korean, and one of the most challenging works for me as a curatorial staff is translation. I think it's one of very different aspect from other forms of artworks, media art. Do you have any experience in dealing with any issue related with the translation process or procedure?
It's an interesting question. I think for the most part, subtitles are used. There are not so many instances of where artworks are dubbed. That's a kind of cultural thing. The French like to dub films. It's pretty accepted within video artworks that there can be subtitles. I think the challenge, and some artists also don't wish that to happen, and that can be, for instance, artists who are working in English, who are exhibiting their work in other areas where they mightn't speak English. They don't necessarily do that, and depending on the format, it's not always easy to do either. But for instance, the Isaac Julian Frantz Fanon film that's going to be screened here, that's been recently remastered, and one of the things they did was new subtitling and translation. So that's just kind of part of the work. I think where it can get challenging in an installation environment is if there's a lot of spoken text and you're not sitting down and watching it kind of over the course of an hour and a half at home or something. There's a risk of losing people. So that's a consideration more for artists in how they create the work.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The clarity of your presentation was just so moving to me, and it also felt that there was a kind of feeling of slowness, which I so appreciate, because most of the time when I go to hear lectures, it's so fast, and I can't absorb, and I want to thank you so much for that. I also wanted to remark that when I heard Janet Cardiff talk, she said that, she and her husband grew up in Canada, so they didn't expect to get out of art school and be stars. And it gave them the opportunity to really experiment. And they didn't expect, as you said, to earn money from their work.
They still don't.
Yeah, right. So it makes it very difficult for artists in our own time. I had a gallery for 20 years in Berkeley, and for artists to really have the time and energy to just consider how to make the work without the concern of supporting themselves. So that's a great dilemma for artists. And artists do continue to keep working even when they don't earn any money, they somehow manage. But that's one consideration, yeah. I also wanted to ask you about certain artists who I love. Are they in the collection, like William Kentridge, Christian Marclay, Bill Viola, and James Turrell? Are they in the collection at all?
The first 3 are. Not James Turrell, because he is, if you like, he's not within the field of interest that's at the core of the collection. But we have two wonderful pieces by William Kentridge, more recent works, video pieces. We have three big installations by Bill Viola, The Crossing, The Greeting, Catherine's Room. And Christian Markley, we have a really fantastic video piece that also has a performance component.
Did you get a chance to see the Kentridge piece that was 3 performances in San Francisco?
Yes. I assume you did.
Yes, I did.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry, I just I didn't know I had the microphone on, but because the Kramlichs are so involved in helping the region think about how to present even works like that, I think that really in so many ways, per your question over here about how we as the Bay Area region come together to educate ourselves, to support a wider ecology for this kind of work, as well as to ask the kinds of questions that are going to be asked in playtime. I really applaud Aebhric and the Kramlich Collection team for being key nodes for helping all of us advance that larger mission. Also, thank you for being with us. Please, as Aebhric said, we're going to be screening Franz Fanon, a piece by Isaac Julian, on November 27th. There's been a lot of interest in this screening, and we've just agreed to rent a second site so that everyone will be accommodated to see that screening. And we really encourage, obviously, all of you to go to Fort Mason to experience this work multiple times over many hours, and look forward to having our students there as well. Please help me for now thank Aebhric Coleman for this incredible teaser.